World War II wasn't only won by courage, tactics, or even genius. It was won by the side that could keep showing up again and again after the first plans failed. After the first ships sank, after the first aircraft burned, after the first winter stalled an offensive. In a total war, the battlefield is only the final stage of a much larger process. Raw ore becomes steel, steel becomes tools, tools become factories. Factories become weapons, and weapons become power across oceans. That process is slow at first, almost invisible until it becomes unstoppable. And when it becomes unstoppable, the enemy doesn't just face an army. The enemy faces a civilization organized for output. That is what the phrase arsenal of democracy really meant. Not a slogan, a strategy. Because if your opponent can replace losses faster than you can create them, your victories stop being decisive and your defeats stop being recoverable. And once you understand that, the story has to begin before the United States entered the war at full scale, before America fought with mass armies overseas, before global operations demanded a constant flood of replacements, and before the industrial machine reached its mature, relentless rhythm. To see how America became the arsenal, we first need to understand what winning means when the war consumes everything it touches. A modern industrial war eats material with a hunger that pre-industrial empires never faced. A single campaign burns fuel by the trainload. Artillery shells vanish in hours. Engines wear out, tires shred, radios fail, trucks break. And every loss creates a second loss. Time, because replacing equipment is never just ordering another one. It requires factories, skilled labor, spare parts, shipping space, training pipelines, maintenance depots, and a transport network that can keep moving even when the enemy is trying to cut it. So the real contest becomes systemic. Can your country convert resources into usable military power faster and more reliably than the enemy, while the enemy actively tries to disrupt the conversion itself? That is why production is not background. It is the backbone that decides whether strategy remains possible. It decides whether defeat becomes disaster or becomes a lesson you can afford. The Axis understood parts of this. Germany pursued rapid rearmament and sought quick campaigns that could end the war before a long economic contest became decisive. Japan aimed to seize resource regions and secure strategic depth. Both, in different ways, were racing against time because the longer the war lasted, the more it favored the side that could expand output, protect shipping, and absorb losses without collapsing internally. And that leads to the first uncomfortable truth. America didn't start the war ready. It started the war capable of becoming ready faster than anyone expected. In the late 1930s, the United States was powerful, but not mobilized for a global two-ocean war. The Great Depression had left factories underused and families cautious. The armed forces were not structured for the scale that was coming. Equipment was uneven. Training capacity was limited. And the political will was uncertain. Many Americans wanted to avoid another European catastrophe. So the problem statement was brutal. How do you transform a society built for consumer production into a war economy without tearing it apart? How do you expand output without creating chaos in materials, shipping, and labor? How do you decide what gets built first and what must wait? The answer wasn't a single act. It was a sequence. Realize the war could become long, plan for scale. Create institutions to coordinate industry. Standardize enough to make production and maintenance scalable. And solve the bottleneck: steel, aluminum, rubber, oil, shipping, and above all, the capacity to build the machines that build everything else. When that machine finally turned, it turned with a momentum that was hard to interrupt, because it wasn't one factory making one weapon. It was a national conversion, learning often painfully how to produce under pressure. But conversions don't happen because of optimism. They happen because the world forces the decision, so we need to step into the global crisis that made American mobilization inevitable. When Poland fell in 1939, it was a warning flare. When France fell in 1940, it was a shockwave. Suddenly, the idea that modern armies could collapse in weeks was no longer theoretical. Britain, under bombing and submarine pressure, became a test of survival by supply. In Asia, Japan's expansion threatened to control raw materials that every modern military requires. And beneath all of it was a reality strategists understood. If the Axis powers consolidated Europe and the Western Pacific, they could become far harder to dislodge. The nation wanted time to prepare, but events were removing time from the map. So, America began acting before formal entry, at full-scale expanding military training and procurement, passing major naval expansion measures, and sliding into an increasingly dangerous Atlantic role. By 1941, US warships were already engaged in tense, lethal encounters during escort and patrol operations. In what was effectively an undeclared naval war in the Atlantic, the only way was applying allies, building stockpiles, training, and expanding capacity before mass armies, and global operations demanded everything at once. And that's why a single phrase mattered, not because it was poetic, but because it fixed the mission in one sentence. Arsenal of Democracy on December 29, 1940. In a fireside chat delivered as Britain faced extreme pressure and America debated the risks of deeper involvement, Roosevelt told Americans the United States must become the great arsenal of democracy. He was solving multiple problems at once. Politically, it framed support as survival, not conquest. Strategically, it treated production as a weapon category, something that could shape the war before troop numbers caught up. Industrially, it gave a simple priority: output matters, and output must be organized, not improvised. Because here's the real issue: without coordination, wartime production becomes friction and waste. Factories chase overlapping contracts. Components don't match. Supply chains collide. One plant builds engines faster than another builds airframes, creating piles of unusable inventory. Another has airframes but no instruments. A tank exists, on paper, but lacks a transmission. And crucially, it wasn't smooth, not at first. Agencies overlapped. The Army and Navy fought over priorities. Firms competed for scarce materials. Plants waited on machine tools, or on copper, or on rubber, or on skilled workers. The system learned by stumbling and by replanning before it stabilized into the more disciplined output people remember. That early friction is not a weakness in the story. It's the realism that makes the later scale believable. And that brings us to the heart of the miracle. Not that America built a lot, but that it learned how to build faster, more repeatably, and at scale, which starts with the most underappreciated factor of all: machine tools and standardization. Before you can mass-produce tanks and aircraft, you must mass-produce the ability to produce. That means machine tools, lathes, presses, milling machines, gauges, jigs, fixtures, equipment that allows precision manufacturing to be repeated thousands of times. People love to count planes and ships. But the deeper story is that machine tools are the factories. If your tooling base is strong, you can expand into almost any product. If it is weak, your output remains limited no matter how brave your soldiers are. Standardization then turns capacity into speed, but it was never instant, and it was never perfect. The U.S. arsenal still carried variety, multiple models, multiple versions, block changes in aircraft, theater-driven differences in radios and packaging, overlapping calibers and standards that took time to harmonize. So, the real advantage wasn't perfect standardization. It was becoming more standardized, over time standardized enough to scale training, maintenance, and spare parts across a global war. And standardization is always negotiation. The military wants the best. Engineers want the possible. Factories want the repeatable. Logistics wants the simple. America's advantage often came from choosing designs that could be produced and maintained in massive numbers, and then improving them continuously rather than chasing perfection at the expense of output. Once you can standardize enough to scale, you face the next brutal question. Can you apply that logic to the most complex machines of the era combat aircraft and keep quality high while output explodes? Air power wasn't optional. In World War II, control of the air shaped everything: convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, bombing campaigns, ground offensives, reconnaissance, and morale. Air forces also consume resources at a terrifying rate. Aircraft are lost in combat, to weather, to training accidents. Engines have limits, airframes fatigue. So the reason America prioritized aircraft wasn't romance, it was necessity. Without aircraft, you cannot protect and project power across oceans reliably. You cannot secure the air and sea lanes that make movement possible. And without replacement capacity, air power becomes a brief advantage that fades. America attacked the aircraft problem like an industrial problem. Expand factories, build training pipelines, scale engine production, create inspection systems, break large assemblies into sub-assemblies that could be produced in parallel, use automotive-style workflow where possible, simplify and standardize components so maintenance crews could keep fleets operational. The myth is a single magical number. The truth is a learning curve. Early inefficiency and bottlenecks gave way to rhythm. And once the line finds rhythm, output becomes a strategic force, predictable, schedulable, and usable for long-term planning. But aircraft only matter if they can be delivered, fueled, and supported. Which brings us to the ocean, because the Atlantic became a battlefield where the enemy tried to strangle the arsenal before it could reach the front. Britain could not fight without imports. The Soviet Union needed supplies. Later, Allied armies in Europe would require a constant flow of fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and food. Germany's U-boat campaign targeted that lifeline because it didn't need to defeat the Allies in a single decisive battle. It only needed to create shortage. A shortage creates hesitation. Hesitation creates delay. Delay creates stalemate, and stalemate creates political fracture. In that sense, the Battle of the Atlantic was not just naval warfare, it was economic warfare aimed at breaking the coalition from within. America's response had two pillars: escort and production. Shipbuilding pushed toward mass methods, simplified cargo ship designs, modular construction, prefabricated sections, multiple shipyards producing standardized hulls. Liberty ships became symbols because they were designed to be buildable fast by a workforce that could be trained at scale. Again, not perfect, but sufficient and producible, which is often what wins. But the Atlantic didn't turn on production alone. The turning of the tide, especially by 1943, came from a combined systems improvement, better escort, doctrine, and coordination. Radar, including more effective sets, HF-DF direction finding, long-range air coverage, and escort carriers closing the air gap. And intelligence that helped convoys avoid danger and escorts find it. Production mattered because it made these solutions deployable at scale: more escorts, Modi aircraft, more sensors, more ships, more trained crews, until the U-boat campaign faced a problem it could not solve. Replacement and adaptation on the Allied side were faster than destruction. And once you can build ships faster than they sink, you confront the next problem. Ships don't win wars by existing. They win by moving supplies to armies, so the story has to turn to logistics on land, where trucks, fuel, spare parts, and organization decide whether breakthroughs become victories. A tank without fuel is just a steel monument. An army without ammunition is a crowd. When Allied forces began moving at high tempo, logistics became the limiting factor. Railroads were vital but vulnerable and often damaged. Ports were choke points. Roads became arteries. The deeper reason logistics mattered is simple. Every mile forward stretches your supply line. The faster you advance, the more fragile you become unless you have the transport capacity, maintenance capacity, and traffic discipline to keep pace. This is where American industrial depth shows up in mundane forms. Trucks, tires, recovery vehicles, repair parts, fuel drums, depots, and traffic control. Systems like the Red Bull Express were not magic. They were emergence logistics, ruthless prioritize, discipline maintenance pre, and brute transport volume plus the human system behind it. Drivers and mechanics doing repetitive work at scale under exhaustion. Because the front line's firepower is often a direct function of yesterday's convoy schedule. But to coordinate logistics at scale, you need more than vehicles, you need a nervous system. And that nervous system is communications. Modern war creates chaos. The side that can reduce chaos faster through communication, reconnaissance, command systems acts with greater unity. But radios, switchboards, encryption, batteries, spare components, and trained signal personnel do not appear by themselves. They are produced and sustained. And because they are technical, they require standardization even more than many weapons do, though, even here. Compatibility was often achieved progressively, not perfectly, as equipment evolved and theaters imposed different constraints. America produced communications gear at scale and trained massive numbers of operators and technicians. It built habits of coordination into operations, calling artillery, adjusting air support, tracking convoys, reporting positions, maintaining supply schedules. When the system works, it seems invisible. When it fails, everything breaks. That is why the industrial story and the battlefield story are inseparable. Communications equipment is industry in your hands, turning scattered effort into organized force. And once a force is organized, the next question becomes brutally simple. Can it sustain firepower? No camera lingers on ammunition factories the way it lingers on aircraft rollouts. Yet modern war devours shells, bombs, and bullets on an industrial scale. Artillery, in particular, is a machine that converts logistics into pressure. Continuous supply means continuous capability. And continuous capability means the enemy has fewer safe moments, fewer chances to regroup, fewer chances to move, fewer chances to recover. Ammunition production demanded safety discipline, chemical supply chains, and steady metal output. It demanded quality control, packaging standards, storage, and transport systems that could deliver to the right place on time. And it demanded redundancy, because disruption and accident, a bottleneck. A shipping shortage could ripple forward into the front line. America's advantage was not that it never faced bottlenecks, but that it could expand capacity, shift contracts, standardize enough to prevent chaos, and keep the stream moving. But production alone doesn't explain why the Allies could fight across multiple continents at once. To understand that, we need to talk about coalition warfare and how Lend-Lease turned American output into a global multiplier. If the Axis powers had one major strategic hope, it was to break the Allies apart before combined strength could fully assemble. Britain, isolated by the Atlantic. The Soviet Union bleeding on an unimaginable front. China, resisting with limited industrial depth. A coalition only exists as long as each member can keep fighting, and in a global war, keeping fighting is not a mood, it is a supply mission. That is why Lend-Lease was not charity, and it was not just politics. It was the industrial logic of coalition warfare. Keep partners strong enough, long enough, that the Axis must fight a multi-front war of compounding demands. Soviet Union's war effort rested on enormous domestic production and staggering sacrifice. Lend-Lease did not replace that. It complemented it often most decisively in categories: that translated directly into operational mobility and staying power. Trucks that expanded logistics reach. Locomotives and rail equipment that helped sustain long-distance supply. Food that mattered in calories and morale. Communications gear and cable. Raw materials and industrial inputs that eased specific bottlenecks. For Britain, Lend-Lease helped keep maritime survival and air defense sustainable while the Atlantic fight evolved. And across the coalition, the mechanics were practical and relentless. Contracts, shipping schedules, cargo priorities, standardization where possible, and constant bargaining over what could be spared without weakening U.S. mobilization. Above all, it required shipping space. Every crate sent overseas competed with every other crate. And once you see Lend-Lease as a global supply engine, the next topic becomes unavoidable if oceans are the arteries. Then naval power and logistics are the heartbeats, and nowhere did distance shape strategy more brutally than in the Pacific. The Pacific War was not only a contest of fleets, it was a contest of reach. The map is the first enemy. Thousands of miles of ocean, scattered islands, limited ports, brutal weather, and long supply lines that could snap under pressure. Japan's early victories weren't just tactical shocks, they were strategic grabs for space and resources. An attempt to build a perimeter that would be costly to penetrate. The U.S. response required more than bravery. It required a logistics philosophy, build the capacity to move and sustain power across the world. Repeatedly, until the enemy's perimeter became a series of isolated problems, instead of an impenetrable wall. This meant carriers, yes, but also oilers, repair ships, tenders, transports, landing craft, construction units, airfields, and a vast flow of spare parts and munitions. The Pacific demanded mobile infrastructure, floating dry docks, forward supply depots, and the ability to repair battle damage far from home. It demanded standardization because the farther you go, the more expensive every unique part becomes. It demanded redundancy because storms, accidents, and combat losses were guaranteed. And it demanded something else that perfectly fits the arsenal theme, strangling the enemy's logistics. Over time, U.S. submarines made Japan's shipping losses catastrophic. As ships vanished, fuel and raw materials stopped arriving in the quantities Japan needed. The war became an industrial siege across water. Not just battles, but starvation of mobility. But to understand why shipping losses hit Japan so hard, you have to follow the war's most controlling resource: fuel. A world war to military is a moving machine. Ships consume fuel every hour they operate. Aircraft consume fuel every mission. Mechanized armies consume fuel every mile. So fuel becomes both necessity and vulnerability because it must be produced, refined, shipped, stored, protected, and delivered in huge quantities. The Axis had chronic fuel constraints, but not in the same way. Germany faced dependence on limited sources, complex substitutes like synthetic fuel, and later a growing vulnerability of fuel infrastructure to attack. Japan faced a maritime dependence. Fuel and materials had to cross oceans to reach the home islands and the fleet. As USC, denial tightened especially through submarines. Japan's fuel crisis became a direct limiter on operations. The United States leveraged domestic oil production and refining capacity, then built the transport and distribution system to project that energy overseas. Tankers moved fuel across oceans. Depots stored it. Pipelines and trucks moved it forward. The system required strict organization because fuel shortages create cascading failures. Grounded aircraft, immobilized armor, halted convoys, delayed offensives. So, the arsenal wasn't only about building weapons. It was about building the energy pipeline that allowed weapons to be used continuously. Once fuel and logistics are in place, you reach the next hard reality. None of it matters if you can't put organized combat power onto hostile shores. Amphibious Operations are brutally demanding because they compress multiple problems into one moment: naval transport, air cover, artillery support, landing craft, engineering, medical evacuation, communications, and immediate resupply, all under fire, in surf, on beaches that may not have ports. The Axis could choose strong points and prepare defenses. The Allies had to create the ability to hit those defenses with overwhelming coordination, then keep feeding forces ashore until a beachhead became a front. This wasn't just courage. It was a systems test. The solution required specialized production, landing craft of many types, amphibious vehicles, portable docks, bridging equipment, and massive stocks of supplies packed for rapid unloading. It required training and rehearsal, which demanded time and resources. It required standard procedures so units from different services could cooperate. And it required a logistics plan that assumed the enemy would try to disrupt everything. And nowhere did that resilience need to be proven more dramatically than in Europe, because D-Day was not only an invasion, it was the opening of an entire supply pipeline across the English Channel. By 1944, the Allied challenge in Europe wasn't merely to land troops. It was to land a continuous flow of men and material faster than Germany could destroy it. An invasion that stalls becomes a disaster. So the motive behind the enormous build-up in Britain was straightforward: create such a surplus of equipment and supplies that the first shock of combat would not break the chain. You don't just need one day's worth of ammunition. You need weeks. You don't just need vehicles. You need spare parts and recovery vehicles. You don't just need fuel. You need distribution. D-Day's miracle was not only getting ashore, it was staying ashore and expanding. The Allies assembled ships, landing craft, and cargo schedules with obsessive detail. They stockpiled equipment in Britain, organized repair and engineering units, and built solutions for a coastline that initially lacked major ports. Some of those solutions became famous because they captured the industrial imagination of the war. Artificial harbors that could be assembled and deployed, and pipeline concepts intended to push fuel forward as the front moved. Not every innovation mattered equally at every moment, but together they reveal the same truth. This invasion was engineered as a logistics pipeline, not a single day of heroism. Which leads directly to the paradox of victory. The moment you break through, you risk outrunning your own supply line. After a breakthrough, every commander wants to press forward. Momentum saves lives and breaks enemy cohesion. But momentum also consumes supplies at an accelerating rate. Vehicles wear out, fuel drains, roads clog, and depots lag behind. This is the victory problem. The better you do tactically, the more you stress your logistics. Many offensives in history have failed not because the enemy was strong, but because the attacker's supply chain became brittle. The Allies countered this through transport surges, route discipline, repair and recovery systems, and the ability to keep pouring replacements into the pipeline. This is where American mass production becomes operational. Enough trucks to run continuous convoys. Enough spare parts to keep a high percentage running. Enough mechanics and tires and engines to prevent the whole system from collapsing. And if you want to understand why the Axis could not solve these problems the same way, you have to look at the constraints tightening around them resources. Bombing, blockade, and strategic trade-offs that compounded over time. The Axis powers were not incompetent. They were dangerous precisely because they were capable. But they faced constraints that became harsher with every year. The war continued. Germany fought a multi-front war and faced growing pressure on transportation networks, fuel supply, and industrial sites. Japan depended heavily on maritime supply lines and imported resources, making it vulnerable to blockade. The motive behind many Axis decisions was therefore urgency. Win quickly. Seize resources. Force negotiation. Break the enemy's will before industrial arithmetic becomes destiny. Under pressure, production choices became compromises. Disruptions to transport reduced efficiency. Shortages forced substitutions. Training pipelines narrowed. Repair cycles stretched. Even when equipment was impressive, sustaining it became harder. Meanwhile, the Allied system backed by American capacity could afford redundancy, multiple factories, multiple shipping routes, larger stockpiles, more spares. And the deeper the war became an industrial contest, the more important the home front became because factories do not run on speeches. Mobilization is a social transformation. You are asking a society to work longer, consume less, accept rationing, live with anxiety, and send millions away. The motive is survival and commitment. If the home front fractures, the front lines eventually follow. But keeping people working and believing is not automatic. It requires organization, messaging, and real results because empty promises don't build tanks. The US expanded the workforce, trained new workers, and absorbed huge shifts in where and how people lived and worked. Women entered industrial roles at unprecedented scale, not as a side story, but as a key capacity expansion. Minority workers sought opportunity in defense industries, even as they faced discrimination and conflict. Another reminder that mobilization is powerful but imperfect. Rationing and war bond campaigns connected daily life to the war effort. And once you understand that the arsenal of democracy was a national conversion, the final question becomes, what did that conversion actually achieve in strategic terms? The arsenal of democracy brought the Allies three things that are more decisive than any single invention: endurance, flexibility, and tempo. Endurance means losses can be replaced and setbacks can be absorbed without collapse. Flexibility means strategy can change, new theaters can be supported. New technologies can be deployed. New offensives can be prepared because the production base can pivot. Tempo means operations can keep coming, forcing the enemy to react rather than plan, and preventing recovery. When you combine these three, you get strategic gravity, a slow, powerful pull that makes the outcome harder and harder to escape. It was achieved through repeatable production, standardized enough logistics, coordinated planning, and a continuous cycle of learning. Factories improved, supply lines matured, training pipelines expanded, and the system became less fragile. And with that to where the story began, not a field, but at a factory gate, because the most honest ending is the one that reminds you victory was built, not found. So when you hear arsenal of democracy, don't picture slogan a wall. Picture the unbroken chain, or to steal to tools to factories, factories to ships and aircraft to convoys and airfields, convoys and airfields to armies that never stopped receiving what they needed to keep moving. Picture the learning curve, the mistakes corrected, the bottlenecks solved, the lines accelerated, the design simplified, the spare parts standardized enough, the schedules tightened, the routes protected. Because in a war measured in years and oceans, the side that can turn effort into output and output into sustained power doesn't just win battles. It shapes the war's possibilities until the enemy runs out of options. That was the arsenal of democracy, not the loudest weapon, but the heaviest one. Not the quickest victory, but the most reliable path to it. And if there's a lesson that survives the 20th century, it's this: in a world where conflict becomes industrial, the ultimate advantage is the ability to organize a society and keep it organized long enough to outbuild the storm.